Have you ever had the experience of believing, with genuine conviction, that you were making a free choice? Choosing your opinions, choosing your values, choosing the direction of your attention, choosing the conclusions your thinking was arriving at, and then encountering, in a moment of unusual clarity, the unsettling possibility that what felt like choosing was actually something considerably closer to responding? That the thoughts you experienced as your own were, in significant part, the predictable outputs of a system of influences so comprehensive, so precisely calibrated to your specific psychology, so deeply integrated into the ordinary fabric of your daily experience, that the boundary between what you chose and what was chosen for you had become genuinely, functionally indistinguishable. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the way that the word manipulation usually implies, with its connotations of obvious deception and clearly identifiable manipulators, but in the quieter, more pervasive, more difficult to resist way of a system that has learned, through the analysis of billions of behavioral data points, exactly which signals to send you, at exactly which moments, in exactly which formats, to produce exactly the responses it requires. If that experience is familiar to you, you have touched something that Yuval Noah Harari regards as the central political and philosophical crisis of the present moment. Not terrorism, not climate change, not economic inequality, though all of these are real and all of them are serious. The central crisis, the one that underlies and amplifies every other crisis, is the crisis of human freedom itself. The possibility, which Harari has articulated with a precision and a consistency that distinguishes his analysis from both the dismissive optimism of the techno-utopians and the theatrical alarmism of the techno-pessimists, that the freedom most people in the modern world believe they possess, the freedom to think for themselves, to form their own values, to make their own choices about the direction of their own lives, is being systematically, comprehensively, and for the first time in human history, technically feasibly dismantled. Not by governments imposing censorship, not by authorities suppressing dissent, but by systems of such extraordinary sophistication and such comprehensive reach that the freedom they are dismantling is being dismantled invisibly, from the inside, in a way that leaves the experience of freedom entirely intact while evacuating its actual substance. This is Harari's most urgent and most disturbing claim, and it requires careful unpacking because it is easily misunderstood. It is not a claim that freedom never existed, that the liberal democratic tradition's commitment to individual rights and political liberty was always a fiction. It is not a claim that all choices are illusory, that the philosophical problems of free will make human agency a conceptual impossibility. It is a specific, historical, technically grounded claim about what has become possible in the last 2 decades through the convergence of specific technologies: mass surveillance, big data analysis, machine learning, the digitization of human attention and behavior. That has created, for the first time in human history, the technical capacity for a form of social control that operates not through the suppression of behavior, but through the shaping of desire. Not by telling you what you cannot do, but by determining what you want to do. Not by restricting your choices, but by constructing the preferences from which you make your choices. Not by controlling your actions, but by colonizing the consciousness from which your actions emerge. To understand why this is historically unprecedented, and why it represents a qualitative break from every previous form of social control that human civilizations have developed, we have to understand something about the nature and the limits of all previous systems of control. Because social control is not new. Every human society in recorded history has developed mechanisms for shaping the behavior, the beliefs, and the loyalties of its members. The question is not whether such mechanisms exist, but what form they take, what limits constrain them, and what capacities of resistance they leave available to the individuals they are applied to. For most of human history, the most powerful mechanism of social control available to those who wielded authority was the control of information. Priests controlled access to sacred texts and sacred knowledge. Monarchs controlled the narrative of political events. Aristocracies controlled the educational institutions that determined whose children received access to the conceptual tools required for critical thought. In each case, the power to shape belief and loyalty derived from the power to determine what information reached which people. And in each case, this power was constrained by a fundamental limitation that Harari consistently emphasizes: the sheer difficulty of processing the vast quantity of information that human beings generate about themselves through their behavior, their communications, their relationships, and their internal states. Even the most sophisticated pre-digital authoritarian systems, the secret police of the Soviet Union, the surveillance apparatus of Nazi Germany, the comprehensive monitoring systems of the most total of 20th century totalitarian states, faced this limitation. They could observe behavior. They could monitor communications. They could infiltrate social networks and record conversations and track the movements of suspected dissidents. But they could not process what they collected with sufficient speed or sufficient comprehensiveness to actually understand, in real time, the internal states of the populations they controlled. The gap between observation and understanding was large enough that the individual human being retained, even under the most oppressive surveillance systems of the 20th century, a significant domain of genuine interiority, a space inside the mind where thoughts could form, where beliefs could develop, where the distance between what was experienced and what was performed for the watching system was large enough to constitute a meaningful form of inner freedom. This is the gap that has been closed, or is in the process of being closed, by the technologies of the present moment. And the closing of this gap is what Harari identifies as the qualitative break that makes the current situation categorically different from every previous situation in which human beings have asked for freedom within a system that was attempting to constrain it. The technologies that are closing this gap are not secret. They are the ordinary, everyday technologies that billions of people carry in their pockets, interact with through their computers, engage with through the smart devices in their homes, and navigate through in the digital environments that mediate an increasing proportion of their waking experience. The smartphone that tracks your location continuously. The search engine that records every question you have ever asked it. The social media platform that monitors not merely what you post, but what you read, how long you pause on each piece of content, what you almost post and then delete, what you scroll past without engaging, what you return to, what triggers you to react, and what triggers you to share, and what triggers you to spend more time on the platform, and what causes you to leave. The streaming service that knows not merely what you watch, but at what moments you pause, rewind, fast forward, and abandon. The navigation application that knows where you go, how often, at what times, and with what changes to your usual patterns. The health monitoring device that tracks your heart rate, your sleep patterns, your physical activity, the subtle physiological markers of your emotional states throughout the day. Each of these systems, individually, generates an extraordinary quantity of data about the person using it. Together, integrated through the data-sharing arrangements that connect the ecosystems of the major technology platforms, they generate something that no previous surveillance system in human history has generated. Not merely a record of behavior, but a model. A detailed, continuously updated, mathematically sophisticated model of the internal states. The preferences, the fears, the desires, the psychological vulnerabilities, the emotional triggers, the decision-making patterns of the specific individual whose data they are processing. A model that, in many cases, predicts what the individual will want, what they will believe, what they will do, and what they will respond to, more accurately than the individual can predict these things about themselves. This is what Harari means when he says that the most revolutionary development of the last 2 decades is not the internet, not artificial intelligence, not any of the specific applications that have captured public attention. It is the development of the technical capacity to hack the human being, to understand the human mind well enough, in sufficient detail and with sufficient predictive accuracy, to intervene in its processes not from the outside, through the restriction of behavior, but from the inside, through the shaping of the desires, beliefs, and attention patterns from which behavior emerges. And to do this invisibly, continuously, at scale, without the individual being aware that the intervention is occurring, because the intervention does not feel like an external imposition. It feels like the natural development of one's own thoughts and preferences. It feels, from the inside, exactly like freedom. The consequences of this development for the human capacity to ask for freedom are profound and require careful examination. Because the question that Harari's title raises, you are asking for freedom in a system designed for total control, is not simply a description of an external political situation. It is a description of an internal one. It is the observation that the freedom being asked for, the freedom of thought, of genuine preference formation, of authentic value construction and authentic choice-making, is being compromised at the level at which it is formed before it arrives at the level of expression or political demand. The person asking for freedom may be asking for it in terms with the specific content toward the specific ends that the system they are asking it from has helped to construct. This is not a paranoid hypothesis. It is an observation grounded in what is already known about how the major technology platforms operate and what effects their operation produces. The Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen's revelations, the internal research documents from multiple major technology companies, the accumulating body of academic research on the psychological and political effects of algorithmic content curation. All of this evidence points in the same direction. The systems that mediate the information environment of billions of people are not neutral conduits for the free flow of ideas and perspectives. They are active shapers of what ideas reach, which people, calibrated through the continuous analysis of behavioral data to maximize specific outcomes, primarily engagement and producing as a byproduct, whether intentionally or not, specific patterns of belief, emotional state, and political inclination in the populations they serve. The political implications of this have already become visible in ways that were not imaginable a decade ago. The degree to which algorithmically curated information environments have contributed to the polarization of democratic politics, the spread of misinformation, the collapse of shared epistemic frameworks, and the rise of political movements whose coherence depends on the maintenance of emotional states of anger and fear that algorithmic systems are extraordinarily efficient at generating and sustaining, is a matter of ongoing and serious empirical investigation. The mechanisms are not fully understood, and the causal attributions remain contested. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Systems designed to maximize engagement have discovered, through the amoral optimization process of machine learning, that the emotional states most reliably associated with extended engagement are the negative ones. Fear, outrage, contempt, tribal solidarity against a perceived enemy. And having discovered this, they have optimized for the delivery of content that generates these states, with effects on the political and epistemic environment of democratic societies that are still being catalogued and still being reckoned with. Harari's analysis extends beyond the specific effects of social media on political polarization, important as those effects are, to the deeper structural question of what the existence of these systems implies for the long-term possibility of genuine human autonomy. The social media effects on political discourse are the early, visible symptoms of a transformation in the relationship between human consciousness and the technological systems mediating it that goes considerably deeper than any specific application or any specific set of observable political effects. The deeper transformation is this. For the first time in human history, the systems through which human beings form their understanding of reality, construct their values, develop their preferences, and make their choices are systems that are designed, optimized, and operated by entities, corporations, governments, and increasingly the AI systems themselves, whose interests in the outcomes of these processes are not identical to the interests of the human beings undergoing them. This has always been partially true. Every information environment that human beings have inhabited has been shaped by interests other than their own. Religions shaped information environments to produce believers. Governments shaped information environments to produce loyal subjects. Educators shaped information environments to produce citizens capable of participation in the collective project of their civilization. The shaping of consciousness by interested parties is not new. What is new is the precision, the scale, and the invisibility of the shaping. Previous systems of consciousness shaping operated through relatively crude instruments and left relatively large gaps through which alternative information, alternative perspectives, and alternative value systems could penetrate. The book that a government tried to ban could be copied by hand and passed between readers. The official narrative that a regime promulgated could be contradicted by direct experience, by contact with people whose lives contradicted the narrative, by the accumulated evidence of daily reality that the most comprehensive censorship apparatus could not entirely prevent from registering on the minds of the people it was supposed to control. Even the most total of previous totalitarian systems left spaces, cracks in the architecture of control, through which a different relationship to reality remained accessible to people with the motivation to seek it. The systems of the present moment are more comprehensive precisely because they do not operate through prohibition and restriction. They operate through curation and recommendation. They do not prevent you from accessing alternative information. They simply arrange your information environment so that the alternative information is less likely to reach you than the information that your behavioral profile suggests will keep you engaged. They do not forbid you from forming different opinions. They simply shape the informational inputs from which your opinions form in ways that make certain opinions statistically more likely than others to emerge. The control is not exercised at the point of output, where it would be visible and resistible. It is exercised at the point of input, where it is invisible and produces its effects before resistance is possible because the desire to resist has not yet been formed. This is what Harari means by a system designed for total control. Not a system in which all choices are forbidden. A system in which the preferences from which choices are made are themselves subject to systematic, continuous, technologically sophisticated management. A system in which the question of what you want, which has always been the most fundamental question of human freedom, because it is the question that all choices reduce to, is itself an output of processes that you do not control and that are not designed to serve your interests in the sense of producing the specific wants that your informed, autonomous, genuinely self-directed consciousness would arrive at in their absence. The question this raises for human freedom is not the abstract philosophical question of free will, which has occupied philosophers for centuries and which remains genuinely unresolved. It is the more specific, more practically urgent question of what freedom means in conditions where the internal processes through which free choices are made are subject to external manipulation at a level of sophistication and a scale of application that has no historical precedent. If the wants from which choices flow are themselves constructed by systems over which the chooser has no meaningful control and whose operation is not transparent to them, in what sense is the act of choosing from among those wants an act of freedom? Harari's answer is not that freedom is impossible under these conditions. It is that freedom under these conditions is considerably more difficult to achieve than most people currently understand, considerably less automatic than the experience of choice suggests, and considerably more dependent on specific practices of consciousness, specific disciplines of attention and self-observation, specific forms of resistance to the default condition of being processed by systems, whose objectives do not include your genuine autonomy, than any version of freedom that previous generations have had to practice. The first form of resistance that Harari's analysis points toward is the most fundamental and, in the contemporary environment, the most countercultural. It is the practice of actually knowing one's own mind. This sounds banal until you consider what it actually requires in the conditions of the present moment. To know your own mind is to be able to distinguish, with some reasonable degree of reliability, between the desires, beliefs, and emotional states that arise from your own genuine encounter with reality, processed through your own genuine values and your own genuine reasoning, and the desires, beliefs, and emotional states that have been generated in you by the external systems managing your information environment. It is to have developed sufficient clarity about your own internal processes to notice when a strong conviction or a strong emotion arises, whether it is arising from your own thinking or from the content that an algorithm has been serving you because it knows, from your behavioral profile, that it will produce exactly this response. This distinction is not easy to make. It is not made through a single act of reflection. It is the product of a sustained, ongoing, disciplined practice of self-observation that most contemporary people have neither the time, nor the encouragement, nor the institutional support to develop. The contemporary environment is, in fact, specifically structured to prevent its development, because a person who has developed this clarity of self-knowledge is a person who is considerably harder to engage, considerably harder to manipulate, considerably harder to keep on the platform longer by the delivery of emotionally triggering content. The clarity that genuine self-knowledge produces is, from the perspective of the attention economy, commercially undesirable. Harari has described, in various contexts, his own practice of meditation as the primary tool he uses to develop and maintain this clarity. Not meditation as relaxation technique, not meditation as stress management. Meditation as the deliberate, sustained, repeated practice of observing the mind's own processes directly, without immediately being captured by them. The practice of noticing a thought arise without immediately believing it. Noticing a desire form without immediately acting on it. Noticing an emotional state develop without immediately expressing it. Creating, through sustained practice, the gap between experience and response in which genuine self-knowledge, and therefore genuine choice, becomes possible. This practice has been described, in various forms and with various cultural elaborations, by virtually every contemplative tradition in human history. Its consistent appearance across traditions as different as Theravada Buddhism and Stoic philosophy and Christian contemplative prayer and Sufi mysticism suggests that it responds to something genuinely fundamental about the architecture of human consciousness. The recognition that the default state of the human mind, left to its own unexamined automaticity, is not freedom. It is the conditioned, reactive, largely automatic processing of experience through the filters of evolutionary programming, cultural conditioning, and the habitual patterns developed through past experience. And that genuine freedom, the freedom of actually choosing rather than automatically responding, requires the development of a specific internal capacity that does not arise automatically but must be cultivated deliberately through sustained practice against the considerable resistance of the mind's own preference for the comfort of its established patterns. In previous eras, the cultivation of this capacity was the province of monks, philosophers, and contemplatives who withdrew from ordinary social life in order to pursue it with the singleness of purpose that the depth of the practice requires. Harari's argument is not that everyone must become a monk. It is that the practices these traditions developed for the cultivation of genuine inner freedom are not luxuries or spiritual indulgences in the current environment. They are necessities. The specific, practically applicable, cultivable capacities that these traditions developed for the observation of one's own mind are the most directly relevant tools available to any person who takes seriously the question of whether their freedom is real or performed in the conditions of the present moment. The second form of resistance that Harari's analysis points toward is epistemic. It is the development of what might be called an active, critical relationship with the information environment, as opposed to the passive, receptive relationship that the design of that environment is structured to produce. An active, critical relationship with information means more than fact-checking specific claims, though that matters. It means understanding, at a structural level, how the information you receive is selected, by whom, on the basis of what criteria, in the service of what interests. It means asking, not merely is this claim true, but why am I seeing this claim rather than another claim at this moment, in this context, and what behavioral response in me is the delivery of this content designed to produce. This is not a natural relationship to adopt toward information in ordinary circumstances. Human beings evolved to process information as if it arrived from reality directly, not as if it arrived from a system that is managing what portions of reality reach them and in what emotional framing. The epistemic default of the human mind is to believe what it perceives, to treat its information environment as a window on reality, rather than as a constructed representation of a selected portion of reality, shaped by the interests of those doing the selecting. This default served well enough in environments where the primary sources of information were direct experience and the testimony of people who shared your physical and social world, whose interests in the accuracy of their testimony you could assess from the context of your ongoing relationship with them. It serves badly in environments where the primary source of information is an algorithmically curated digital stream constructed by systems whose transparency about their own operation is minimal, and whose interests in the accuracy and balance of what they serve you are at best secondary to their interest in the duration and intensity of your engagement. The epistemic practices required to navigate this environment well are practices that must be deliberately developed, because the environment itself provides neither the incentive nor the infrastructure to develop them. On the contrary, It provides powerful incentives to accept the information stream as it arrives, to engage with it emotionally rather than critically, to share what triggers the strongest reactions rather than what merits the most careful consideration. The third form of resistance is political, and it is perhaps the most important in the long run, because individual practices of mindfulness and critical information literacy, however important for the individual who develops them, cannot by themselves address the structural conditions that make the development of genuine freedom so difficult in the present environment. The political question is not how individual human beings can protect their autonomy within the current system. It is how democratic societies can develop institutional frameworks adequate to the challenge of governing technologies of consciousness management that operate at a scale and with a sophistication that no existing regulatory framework was designed to address. Harari has been consistently critical of the degree to which this political challenge has been deferred, not because the mechanisms of democratic governance are unavailable, but because the interests that would be constrained by effective regulation of the attention economy are among the most powerful economic interests in the contemporary world, and because the complexity of the technological systems in question has provided convenient cover for the argument that meaningful regulation is either impossible or would suppress innovation in ways that outweigh its benefits. He is not persuaded by these arguments. He is persuaded that the failure to develop adequate political frameworks for governing the technologies of consciousness management is one of the most consequential political failures of the present era, with implications for the long-term viability of the democratic institutions that the failure is occurring within. Democratic institutions depend, for their legitimacy and their function, on the premise that citizens are capable of forming genuine preferences, making genuine judgments, and expressing genuine choices through the mechanisms of democratic participation. If the preferences, judgments, and choices of citizens are themselves subject to systematic management by private systems operating in the interests of their owners rather than the interests of the democratic community as a whole, then the outcomes of democratic processes reflect not the genuine preferences of citizens but the outputs of the systems managing those preferences. The election result that reflects the genuine preferences of an informed citizenry is a fundamentally different thing from the election result that reflects the preferences that have been constructed in the citizenry by the systems curating their information environment. Both look like democracy from the outside. Neither requires any violation of electoral law. But only one is democracy in the substantive sense that democratic theory requires. Harari's most alarming observation about this situation is not that authoritarian governments are using these technologies to control their populations, though they are, and the examples of what comprehensive digital surveillance and AI-enhanced social control make possible in contexts that are not constrained by democratic norms are genuinely alarming. His most alarming observation is that these technologies are producing effects on the genuineness of preference formation and the quality of political judgment in democratic societies as well, not through state control, through market dynamics, through the organic operation of profit-seeking systems whose optimization for engagement has produced, as a byproduct rather than as an intention, systematic effects on the information environments and therefore on the preference-forming processes of the citizens of democracies. The distinction between authoritarianism and democracy was always grounded, at its deepest level, in the distinction between populations whose beliefs and preferences were managed by the state and populations whose beliefs and preferences were formed through genuinely free inquiry and genuinely free exchange of ideas and genuinely free encounter with a diversity of perspectives. If that distinction is being eroded from the inside, not by state action but by market dynamics operating on the architecture of the information environment, then the political category of democracy is being hollowed out at its foundation without any of the dramatic markers of political collapse that would trigger the alarm systems of a society trained to watch for the specific forms of political threat that the 20th century taught it to fear. This is why Harari says you are asking for freedom in a system designed for total control. Not because the system is controlled by a specific villain with a specific plan for your subjugation, but because the system that has come to mediate your relationship with information, with social connection, with the formation of your values and preferences and beliefs, has been designed, not with malice but with the amorality of optimization, in ways that are structurally incompatible with the kind of genuine autonomy that freedom in any meaningful sense, requires. The system is not designed to suppress your freedom. It is designed to generate engagement. But the mechanisms through which it generates engagement are mechanisms through which your preference-forming processes are continuously managed in ways that serve the system's interests rather than yours. The freedom you are asking for, the freedom to think your own thoughts, form your own values, make your own choices about what matters and what you will give your attention and your loyalty and your trust and your energy to, requires the protection and the cultivation of the internal space from which genuine preference formation and genuine choice-making emerge. And that space is exactly what the system is designed, with extraordinary technical sophistication, to colonize. This does not mean the freedom is unachievable. It means that it must be understood, in the current conditions, as something considerably more active, considerably more deliberate, and considerably more demanding than the liberal democratic tradition has typically suggested freedom requires. In the tradition of political liberalism, freedom was primarily understood as freedom from external constraint. The absence of laws that forbid thought, the absence of authorities that punish belief, the presence of legal protections that prevent the state from interfering in the internal processes of the individual mind. This understanding of freedom assumed that if external constraints were removed, the internal processes of the human mind would naturally produce genuine freedom of thought and genuine authenticity of preference. This assumption was never entirely accurate, because human minds are always shaped by the cultural environments they develop within. And cultural environments are always shaped by interests that are not identical to the interests of every member of the culture. But it was accurate enough, in the conditions of previous centuries, to function as a workable political framework. The external constraints were the most pressing threat to genuine freedom. Their removal was the most significant political achievement available to the liberal democratic tradition. And once removed, the freedom that developed in their absence was genuine enough, reliable enough, to ground the democratic project of collective self-governance by genuinely self-determining citizens. The conditions of the present moment require an updated understanding of what freedom requires, one that recognizes that the primary threat to genuine freedom in the current environment is not external constraint but internal management. That the most significant obstacle to genuine self-determination is not the law that forbids a thought, but the system that shapes the preferences from which thoughts arise. That the political project of protecting freedom now requires not merely the defense of civil liberties in the traditional sense, but the development of the institutional frameworks, the educational practices, the personal disciplines, and the cultural values that protect the integrity of the internal processes through which genuine freedom, if it exists at all, must ultimately be grounded. Harari's analysis of what genuine freedom requires in the conditions of the present moment converges, perhaps unexpectedly, with the oldest insights of the philosophical traditions that have thought most carefully about the relationship between freedom and the nature of the mind. The Stoics understood that genuine freedom was not the freedom from external circumstances, which no human being can fully achieve, but the freedom that comes from mastery of the internal processes through which external circumstances are evaluated and responded to. The contemplative traditions of multiple cultures understood that the default condition of the human mind, left to its own unexamined automaticity, is a form of slavery to its own conditioned patterns, and that genuine freedom requires the specific, cultivable, demanding internal work of seeing those patterns clearly and developing the capacity to choose one's relationship to them rather than simply enacting them. These traditions were not describing the specific technological conditions of the present moment, but they were describing something about the architecture of the human mind and the relationship between that architecture and genuine freedom that has become more practically urgent and more politically relevant in the present moment than it has ever been before. Because the technologies that have made the management of internal states technically feasible at scale have also made the philosophical insights of these traditions about the nature of genuine freedom more practically necessary and more directly relevant to the political questions of the present era than they have been since these insights were first articulated. The question you are asking when you ask for freedom is not a simple one. It is not answered by the legal protections that prevent the government from reading your messages or criminalizing your opinions, though those protections matter and must be defended. It is not answered by the technical privacy tools that prevent the most obvious forms of data collection, though those tools have value. It is answered, to the extent that it can be answered at all, in the conditions of the present moment, by the sustained, demanding, genuinely countercultural work of developing and protecting the internal space from which genuine thinking, genuine valuing, and genuine choosing become possible. That work is personal. It requires the individual to develop, through sustained practice, the capacity for the kind of self-observation that makes it possible to distinguish between one's own genuine responses to reality and the responses that the systems managing one's information environment are producing. It requires the willingness to tolerate the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, genuine not knowing, genuine open inquiry, rather than the comfortable certainty that emotionally curated content consistently provides. It requires the discipline to seek out perspectives that challenge one's established beliefs, to expose oneself to the friction of genuine intellectual encounter with difference, rather than remaining within the algorithmically curated comfort of the information bubble that the system's optimization for engagement reliably creates. And it requires, perhaps most importantly, the recognition that freedom in the conditions of the present moment is not a status that can be achieved and then maintained without effort. It is a practice, an ongoing, demanding, never completed practice of maintaining the integrity of the internal processes through which genuine self-determination becomes possible. A practice that the surrounding environment is not designed to support. A practice that the most powerful economic systems in the contemporary world have a structural interest in making as difficult as possible to maintain. And a practice that is, despite all of this, not impossible. Not for the individual willing to take its demands seriously. And not, potentially, for the societies willing to develop the institutional frameworks that would make its demands more widely accessible. Harari's warning is not a counsel of despair. It is a call for a specific kind of clarity about what freedom actually requires in the conditions that have been created, and about what the cost of failing to understand those requirements will be for the human beings who experience that failure, and for the democratic civilizations that depend, for their genuine functioning rather than merely their formal continuance, on populations capable of exercising it. You are asking for freedom in a system designed for total control. The answer to that situation is not to stop asking. It is to understand, with complete honesty and complete seriousness, exactly what you are asking for, exactly what stands between you and it, and exactly what the practice of genuine freedom requires from a human being willing to pursue it in the conditions of the world that currently exists, as opposed to the conditions of a simpler world that no longer does. That understanding is the beginning. Not a comfortable beginning. Not a beginning that the systems surrounding you will support or encourage or make convenient. But the only beginning that leads somewhere real. The only beginning that takes the question of freedom seriously enough to actually try to answer it. And in trying, in the full awareness of what the trying requires and what it costs, to become, in whatever measure the effort makes possible, genuinely free.